Chapter 5. Beauty and Bernice. From the informative record of recent Grell history. In the chambers of the Perfecton city, the Grell master smacked the facial tentacles of a servitor with its own. Insult. Waste of genetic data. The Grell master hooted at his hapless servant. I ordered you to immobilize the human, not disintegrate it. The servitor pointed helplessly at the now empty corridor down which Stokes had fled. My datax was set on immobilize, it pleaded. Theory. Perhaps our weapons act differently in this building. The Grell master glared at him for a moment. Weak theory. We shall proceed. We shall find the other beings in the humans' party, capture them, and extract data from their brains. Forward. Extract ends. Stokes had screamed as he'd fallen down the hole, a noise which probably added, accidentally, to the impression that he had been vaporized. The hole had opened up beneath him at the instant that the Grell had opened fire, and the trapdoor had slammed shut behind him again an instant later. He fell down a glowing green tunnel, rings of light flashing by him at such a speed that he was convinced that, should he ever hit the bottom, the impact would be quite fatal anyway. But when the bottom of the tube was in sight, and Stokes had put his hands over his eyes, furiously checking off the entry conditions for every religion he had ever heard about, he found that he had started to slow down. His fall became a slower fall, then a drift, then almost a hover, as he touched his feet down on a glowing green surface, and fell in a heap as whatever field had supported him let go. "Ah, there you are, Stokes," called Singh. "Come and have a look at this." The artist clambered to his feet, steadying himself mentally, and made his way to the chamber where the other academics were standing. The floor he had landed on was located under an overhanging roof, and Stokes was initially surprised to see that the others seemed to be standing outdoors. The quality of light, the sky above their heads, the clouds. Well, some sort of strange spatial curving thing must have happened, if this was a world where you could fall downwards and pop up on the surface again. Singh and Farouk would probably be debating about it already. But when he stepped from under the roof, he realized where he actually was, and staggered back again. His friends were standing before him on a raised, round, green islet at the side of a silver floor. A vast silver floor. A silver floor that he had initially taken to be an ocean. He couldn't see the edge of it for the clouds. He looked at the clouds that were drifting across the other side of the floor and followed them up. Up into something that wasn't a sky, but was actually a roof thousands of feet up. It was glowing with a very sky-like golden glow, and one patch, hidden behind the roof overhead, was glowing brighter than the rest, like a setting sun. Otterbland saw Stokes's expression and laughed, taking him by the shoulder and leading him to where the academics all sat on their dais. We think this chamber would take several days to drive across, and you could fly a pod in here with no trouble. That ceiling's so high. The brightness in the sky is moving, by the way. Owl looked up at him, at about the speed of apparent motion that Perfecton Sum would have got up to in its younger days. Oh, thanks for saving our lives, by the way. Some of the other academics added their thanks, with varying degrees of affection and volume. Stokes sat down heavily, feeling dwarfed by the sheer scale of things around him. Big, isn't it? Bernice woke up at the feel of lips kissing hers. She didn't open her eyes. Were these lips Jason's? No, not enough stubble on the chin. Were they then Doran's? Or, her brain persisted with the new information it had for her, even though she could still hardly believe it, that dwarf version of him they called cute. No, these lips were a bit too sure of themselves for that. She opened her eyes, and found that she was lying in a vast carved bed in a round room, that her upper arm was bandaged, and that she was being kissed by that man with the army. She jumped and pushed him off. Stop! What are you doing?" He straightened up, smiling. "Why? You had been asleep for several days, and that is the traditional method of waking one such as you." "Charming," Bernice muttered. "At your service." The man in the cloak and tights bowed. "I am Prince Charming, son of King Rupert. I woke you because the royal apothecaries assured me that your arm is healed, and I thought that you might wish to attend the king's ball this evening." "Ball? But—" "I shall leave you in peace. You will see me this evening. I hope that you might consider sharing the first dance with me, you beautiful, mysterious stranger." He gave her what he obviously thought was a smouldering look, and left. The door swung closed behind him, to reveal Wolsey hiding there, a set of lockpicks in his claws. "Dick," he purred, "we really do have to talk." Bernice flopped back on her pillow, boggled beyond all boggle. "How long have I been asleep?" she demanded. 3 days. Wolsey hopped onto the end of the bed and regarded her, his furry chin on his fist. "The prince has made sure that candy woman and those deluded dwarves have been given the finest apartments. That candy woman, as you call her, is a man. Don't you start. I'd heard about noblesse oblige, but that prince seems to think you're much too obliging, and much too— My arm! It's healed almost completely." Bernice had gingerly started to touch the skin of her upper arm. "So we can get injured here, but it's as if this world doesn't like it very much. Are my boots around here?" Wolsey glanced over the end of the bed. "No. Dick, what are these strange things of which you speak? We've known each other all our lives. Is it that you have succumbed to madness, or—" He cast a glance at the doorway. "Has the whole world gone mad?" "I promise that I'll explain," Bernice told him. "Turn your back. I'm going to find some clothes." "Turn my back," Wolsey spluttered. "Dick, you and I have bathed in the same bath when times were hard, and I've seen you poo, but I still think you ought to turn your back, or you'll get a whole new perspective on Dick." Reluctantly, Wolsey turned. Bernice headed for the wardrobe and, not finding her jerkin and tights, grabbed everything she could lay her hands on. A few minutes of serious lacing and coughing, and she called to the cat to turn round again. She stood there in a long blue court dress, with a white bodice, silver shoes, and a pointy hat with a piece of silk trailing from it. Wolsey looked her up and down. Not very convincing. Bernice took his arm and led him towards the door. "It's time, old friend, to explain to you who I really am." "I suppose I always knew," the cat sighed. "But behind closed doors is one thing. Are you really going to go out dressed like that?" "Big, isn't it?" said Stokes. "You have been saying that for the last hour," murmured Singh. The party of academics had been walking across the great hall for that last hour, spurred on by the thought that the Grell might have fallen down the same shaft as they had. Initially, they had just set out to cross the vast silver floor, but, after walking for about 30 minutes, they had come to a black line. The line was heading, as the mathematicians agreed, for the centre of the hall, where, in the far distance, a cluster of what must have been rather large buildings stood. Through the clouds in the dome of the hall could be glimpsed some large mass hanging on the ceiling, approximately above the buildings on the ground. It was, they had all agreed, at least something to aim for. The sky was darkening rapidly. The day here was utterly different from that on the surface, and everybody was starting to feel lagged. The group of walking professors had become a straggly column as academics paired off or talked in groups, pointing up at some new feature of interest in the ceiling above them. Stokes had been idly twisting the butt of the gun, hoping to make the vase appear again to please the physicists. In truth, this fiddling also helped to pass the time. Stokes could still feel the sensation of guns trained on his back. He couldn't get it out of his mind. He felt hunted, as if Grell could appear at any moment. There was a shout from the front of the party. Everybody at the back ran forward, colliding with those from the front who were running back, until everybody was milling around in a shouting mass. Stokes elbowed his way to the front. When he saw what everybody was staring at, he shuddered. In front of the academics stood a single Grell, just staring at them, spinning its axe threateningly. Those who had made their way to the front made to go back again, but some of their less courageous colleagues pushed them forward, urging them to reason with the alien or attack it. When the Grell made no move, the group quietened a little, gazing at it uneasily. "Where did it come from?" asked Stokes. "It appeared," said Lucinda. "One moment it was not there, the next it was." Stokes took a deep breath and stepped towards the creature. It turned to look at him, mouth tentacles flexing. There was something different about it, a pale green glow that surrounded it. Ah! Stokes bravely strode right up to the Grell and waved a hand in front of its face. His fellow academics oohed and ahed in a most satisfying way. The Grell made little head movements as it followed his hand, but did no more. Stokes turned back to them triumphantly. "No need to fear," he said. "This is the Grell that I shot with the gun. It's been vased. It's not quite here." He ran a hand through the image of the Grell, and was startled to feel textures brush against his skin, as slight as silk or breezes on his hand. The Grell shook and shivered, looking around itself. As Stokes's hand passed out of it, it seemed to see him perfectly for the first time. It took a moment to adjust itself to speaking English. "New fact. The human that shot me is here," it said, its voice sounding as if it was echoing down a long corridor. "A human is in Slawcore." "Slawcore?" asked Stokes. "This is Slawcore, where all facts are known, and there are no queries." "Their afterlife," hissed Epstein. "The Chelonians boast about sending them there." Stokes put a finger to his chin, deep in thought. "Query," he began. "You cannot have queries in Slawcore." "I am a foolish human, and am very fortunate to be in Slawcore. So I still have queries, and you must answer them." Query: why did the Grell come to Perfecton? On the trading world of Mus, our master heard stories of the technology of the Perfectons, and of how their world was soon to be left unguarded. What did you hope to find? Transdimensional bridge technology that would give us access to all knowledge. It would be like Slawcore while alive. Unlimited information. It would be... The Grell stopped suddenly, its mouth tentacles wriggling fiercely. Query! It stopped again. Fact. I can query. Fact. I have need for queries. Fact. Humans cannot enter Slawcore. Now don't start jumping to any conclusions. Conclusion. I am not in Slawcore. I have been accessed by this technology. You have interrogated me. More of a quiet chat, really. I must escape. The Grell looked to its left and right, and then paused, seeming to concentrate. There is all time and space here. I must travel, wherever I go. Suddenly, it flipped off backwards, its image spinning over and over, and receding until it vanished into a point. The green glow faded from that point, but just before it did, the academic started at the sound of a sudden falling scream. Stokes fiddled frantically with the bulb on the end of the gun. "Can't you get it back?" asked Otterbland. "I don't think so," sighed Stokes. "I think he's gone to wherever he was going." Wolsey had led Bernice to the battlements of the castle. From there, they looked down onto the sunny expanse of the kingdom, trees and hills and windmills and rivers and roads, golden under a perfect blue sky. There was no wind. The landscape spoke to Bernice of a golden age, that period every culture has, that was just a few generations ago, when everything was great. Only those golden ages were the products of grumpy old folk with selective memories. And this was one she was walking about in. It was golden, however, apart from the Grell. She wondered what havoc they were causing somewhere in this idyll. She sat down, her back against the parapet, wrapping her hands around her knees. She needed one person, at least, to understand the truth. Thing is, Wolves, I remember a life before this one, where I was a completely different person. My name isn't Dick, it's Bernice. He scowled. Don't be Bernice, she emphasized. Bernice Summerfield. I'm a professor of archaeology from the year 2593. I get the feeling that something in this place would like me to forget that, so forgive me if I keep repeating it. I'm a woman, not a boy, as you'd have found out if you'd looked round when I was dressing just now. You are as mad as that woman who tried to sell me the magic beans. I don't believe a word of this tale. I leave you to sleep in the forest, and when you wake up, you're a different person. Were you taken by the fairies? Bernice frowned in frustration, trying to think of a way to convince him. All right, so tell me about Dick, the person that I used to be. What was his surname? Whittington. Richard Whittington. Bernice was surprised to find the name familiar. That's a real person, a historical figure, 3 times Lord Mayor of London between 1397 and 1420. Well, that's always been your ambition. You told me that the streets were paved with gold. Bernice glanced over her shoulder at the perfect landscape below. Looking at this lot, I may have been right. So I'm him, am I? She tapped the stone of the parapet as an idea came to her. She pointed at the landscape beyond. Wait a minute. You can tell me that I'm Richard Whittington if you want, but you're not telling me that this kingdom, with King Rupert and everything, is England in the 14th or 15th century? Wolsey leant back on the parapet, his tail nervously whipping back and forth like a restless snake. He looked around the countryside for a moment, as if searching for a familiar landmark, and an uneasy growling rose from his throat. It was some time before he spoke. That has occurred to me. This must be some small kingdom in Surrey or Kent that the real king tolerates. He still looked uncertain. I didn't know that places like this still existed. Oh, Wolsey. Bernice stood up, gave him a hug, and began to stroke him behind the ears. You can't really believe that. The cat gently took her hand away from his head. Please, with you dressed like that, that's rather disturbing. Tell me. He licked his lips with his long tongue, clearly perplexed. This is important. Where did you acquire your knowledge of those demons you call the Grell? You know every blasted detail about them. Yet I, who have been by your side always, have never seen them. Exactly. That's the kind of anomalous detail which I'm talking about. I first met the Grell. She frowned, as if surprised by her own memories. She put a hand to her brow. In my bedroom, when I was a child. I thought that it was a nightmare. One of them ran through my room, out of the wall, and then it fell through the floor. It screamed as it fell. She had wandered a little distance from the cat now, wondering where these memories had come from. She didn't remember remembering that in the past. I see, said Wolsey, more baffled than ever. I assumed that I must have been asleep at the time. But the point is, where did you get all these details that you told the dwarves about how those things live and die? For the past few days, Gushy has been regaling me with stories of your secret knowledge. That's because I've encountered them on several occasions, getting in the way of various archaeological expeditions on various planets. Wait. Wolsey raised his paw. Archaeology, this word you've used twice now is, well, I know not what. And planets are only those things that determine our fate, as seen by old ladies in tea leaves. Bernice suddenly knew that she was absolutely right about the anomalous nature of this world. She grabbed Wolsey by the shoulders. Tea? The cat looked at her stunned. If you want. Bit early for me. No, tea. You can't drink tea. Not in the England of 1420, you can't. Not in the England of knights and castles either. She held on to the cat as he tried to twist from her grasp, not wanting to meet her gaze. You've started to see it, haven't you? You've started to see that this world you live in just does not make sense. Wolsey took a deep breath and looked at her. A shadow fell across them both, as if the sun had suddenly gone into eclipse. Wolsey automatically stepped forward, shielding Bernice with his body. Beside the door to the stairs stood a strange figure. He was tall and thin, dressed in long, flowing black robes, and a turban with a jewel in it. He had a pair of hawk-like piercing eyes, and a vast grin. There was something strange about him, Bernice realised, but she couldn't quite pin down what. I'm sorry if I startled you, he said. His voice was swooping in English. It didn't go with his clothes at all. Who are you, then? Asked Bernice, stepping out from behind her cat. The man bowed. I am the king's vizier, and your humble servant, your highness, your most worthy, your highest upon high, etc., etc. Your highness? He took her hand and planted a kiss on her knuckle, grinning his vast, toothy grin at her. He looked like he was able to take a bite out of the world itself. Your beauty is like that of the very stars. Yes, from a distance they seem cold, but get too close and you'll lose your eyebrows. Bernice smiled politely, shaking her hand loose from his. Stop messing about, the vizier giggled indulgently. He suddenly became serious again. I come to you with a message from your father. From my father? Bernice boggled again, and decided to stop boggling and take everything on board. This vizier had definitely not just popped back from a day trip to the home counties on Earth, where her real father ran a restaurant. What did he say? He wishes to see you urgently. He said something about romance? The vizier twiddled his eyebrows meaningfully, grinned another vast grin, and then, with a sweep of black satin and a high chuckle, left. Wolsey poked at his ear, looking puzzled. Do you hear a hissing sound? He said. Yes, Bernice nodded. I thought it was you. So I'm royalty now, am I? Wolsey leant on her shoulder. Which means your father is the king, Princess Bernice. Yes, Hey! She smiled and gave him a quick tickle on the stomach. You called me Bernice. Let's just say that I want to believe, Wolsey told her, patting her hand, even if it does severely limit my supply of dick jokes. Bernice headed for the king's chamber, feeling quite triumphant. She'd made one person believe her, at least. Sort of. She hadn't felt that nausea of unreality since she'd woken up, but the sleep itself was a worry. Where had she been while she slumbered? No dreams, no memory of time past at all. She had a terrible vision of herself as a stream of data, and an awful feeling that she'd been switched off. At least she hadn't been reprogrammed to fit in. The castle itself was a delight, a vastly conflicting mess of styles that seemed to be the product of an insane designer. The outside walls were white, with silver spires curling upward like some late Germanic folly. But inside, The banners and flags looked medieval, and the pages and courtiers she passed were dressed in bright colours, jerkins and tights. A sort of horrid collision between the Jacobean era and the Renaissance. On the way to see the king, she had to ask various of them the way, and was surprised that all of them bowed or curtsied to her. Amazing the difference of frock mate. She was suddenly the king's daughter, another handbrake turn of plot, but quite a fun one. Better than being Dick. She vaguely recognised quite a few of those she talked to. But what was an obviously European king doing with a vizier? And what did a vizier do exactly? She had so few answers. She found the king's chamber at the top of a grand flight of marble steps, up and down which servants were running as the preparations continued for the ball that evening. The whole castle was in uproar, with food being delivered, entertainers rehearsing, and bunting being hung. Despite Bernice's situation, it was all rather exciting. She stopped outside the door of the chamber. From inside, she could hear the sounds of a woman sobbing. Then she heard the king's voice. He sounded mocking and cruel. Oh dear, he was that sort of king then. This world was about to take a turn for the worse. Taking a deep breath, Bernice knocked on the door and, without waiting to be asked, entered. The king looked sharply across at her from where he was sitting on his throne, his face set in a scowl. "Yes," he growled. "What is it?" On the other side of the room stood a beautiful young woman in a green dress, who was crying into her handkerchief. But Bernice's attention was focused completely on King Rupert, because she knew exactly who he was. "Captain Balsam!" she exclaimed. The king blinked, not knowing quite how to respond. The girl in the corner threw down her handkerchief and shouted at the king, "You can't keep me here forever. My love will come and save me." "I'm sure he will, my dear." The king, or Balsam as Bernice knew him, got to his feet, his attention diverted away from Bernice. He went to the table and poured himself a goblet of wine from a flagon. "And when he does, my men shall be waiting for him. I think I shall give you his head as a keepsake." He threw back the wine and grinned, giving out a little malicious chuckle. The girl gathered up her skirts and ran out, shrieking. She slammed the door behind her. Bernice glared at the king. That wasn't very nice. His Majesty slumped back into his throne, suddenly looking rather sad. "Oh, I know. Daughters. What can you do with them? Apart from you, of course, my dear." He gestured for Bernice to take a seat opposite him, and she did so. "You're the only one of them who doesn't cause me pain. Aurora's asleep in her tower. Marion there. Well, I just can't understand her choice of boyfriends. I'm a good king, I really am, but I have this terrible blind spot concerning her Robin, and that gang of his. Normally I'm fair and just, and actually rather jolly, but whenever I hear about what that lot in the forest are up to, it turns me into some sort of evil villain. I just can't help myself." "No," muttered Bernice. "I'm sure you can't. Tell me, does the name Balsam mean anything to you?" "Why, of course it does, child. It's our family name, the name of the royal house. You should know that." "Oh, of course, Dad. I'm just having one of those forgetful days." Bernice stood up and wandered over to the king, putting a hand on the shoulder of his elegant purple doublet. "Tell you what, can I do something that I used to do when I was a kid? That old joke of ours." "Oh, yes, of course." The king looked at her suspiciously. She reached out and tugged his beard, pulled it left and right, all the way she knew of loosening the bolt that held an android's facial plate in place. But the king's face stayed on. When she let go, he rubbed his chin and winced. Bernice shrugged. So much for that idea. The king, still looking perplexed, picked up a piece of parchment from beside his throne. Now, you may be wondering why I called you here today. As you are my eldest and most useful daughter, I have decided that it's time you got married. Oh no, Bernice raised her hands. Been there, done that. Painted the spare bedroom. The king ignored her. Now, there are several eligible bachelors in the kingdom. I've prepared a list. These will all be at the ball tonight. There's the Marquis de Shah, a very rich young man, so I'm told. Young Jack from the village. Exactly the opposite, poor but honest. Also, John Wood, who's a woodcutter, will be there. Big and strong, if you like that sort of thing. Thanks for giving me such a wide selection, Bernice muttered. I have a letter here. He took a bottle from Bernice's throne and tipped a rolled-up note out of it. From a Mr. Crusoe who, it seems, is marooned on an island. He'd like to be rescued, find his one true love, etc. Sounds a nice chap, but perhaps he's more in need of a secretary than a wife. Sort of a girl Friday. Indeed, the king nodded. He won't be at the ball, of course. Now, we must not discount the interest of young Prince Charming. Bernice froze. Perhaps we'd better, unless you do things very differently here. Eh? He is, after all, my brother. What? The king leapt to his feet aghast. There was a moment of silence, and Bernice looked at the king in curiosity. His face had glazed over. For a moment, he looked as if he was communicating with something divine, deep in meditation. Then, just as suddenly, he relaxed again, and his features creased into a booming laugh. Ah, my dear daughter, there is something that I have never mentioned to you. The boy you think of as your brother was a foundling, an infant discovered in the forest. He and his sister, the girl you know as your sister Aurora, were found near to a strange cottage made entirely of chocolate and other sweets. I adopted them as my own. Charming has known the truth for years. So you mustn't be disturbed by his admiration for you, or your love for him. Bernice gave this monarch a hard stare, wishing that she had her glasses with her so that she could glance intimidatingly at him over them. Fine. Interesting. So, who else is on the list? The king turned back to his parchment, his contemplation forgotten. Well, this is also, if I may coin a pun, a little incestuous. But my vizier has been expressing an interest in you lately. He's gone so far as to ask formally for my permission to court you. But if you want to go down that route, I'm afraid you'll have to give up all interest in little Arab boys. Eh? As will he, the king laughed. We'll have no more of that. That's a bit too much to ask. Bernice was starting to get scared again. She felt as if she was being rushed towards a conclusion, towards being married off. That moment of closure that, in books, was like a little death. Having newly discovered life after marriage, this was an absolute nightmare made flesh. Even worse, she'd found that, during this conversation, she'd wanted to blurt out all manner of strange things. That she loved so-and-so, that she'd never marry another one. Opinions which weren't hers. It was as if this world was forcing her to make a choice, aching for closure. Fortunately, Bernice had had a lifetime of drinking serious ale, and knew how to stop herself blurting out words that would get her into serious trouble. Words like, I'd love to see your judo trophies, or, yes, I did snog him in the kitchen, what of it? But this felt much more serious than that. She had a terrible feeling that, had she made a choice, she might, when she next woke, find that it was a few weeks later, and that she was in some stranger's marriage bed. Very scary. She needed to learn a lot more about this place. Quickly. The king had come to the end of his list, and was looking at her expectantly. She said to him, why don't I have a look at them at the ball, and make up my mind then? The king clapped his hands together. Wonderful! You'll have the opportunity to get to know all of them this evening. His grin faded as a thought struck him. If Marion's going to pine, do you think I should invite this Robin fellow? Bernice raised an eyebrow. Why change the habit of a lifetime? The afternoon tamed into a whirl of dress fittings and fashion tips, the ladies of the court attending to put Bernice into a vast multi-petticoated dress that was, of course, in an Edwardian style. Wolsey watched from the corner of her bedroom, shaking his head every now and then, despite his newfound belief in the feminine nature of his oldest friend. Bernice had managed to get ball invitations for him, Candy, and the dwarves. She'd noticed a certain reticence on the part of the courtiers towards Wolsey, an unwillingness to deal with him. Now, as the ladies busied around her with their lace and tape measures, she would reach out a claw every now and then to snag one of their bustles. They detached themselves from him without anger, but with a little disturbed glance, as though he was in the wrong place, a gatecrasher. The dwarves, Wolsey told Bernice, don't know who you are. They're pleased that you've turned out to be a princess, because, I quote, "You're so beautiful that you must be one." That's cute. They should have named him Mawkish. The vizier is also certain that you're a princess. He seemed to be taking this hissing sound with him wherever he went, insisted that you had always lived here, except when being spirited away by an Arabic boy. If only. What about Charming? He thinks he found you in the forest, a lost princess. He laughed out loud when I suggested that you were his sister. Bernice leant on the wall of her room as she was stitched into her bodice. Curious. Whew. In this thing, it's just as well one doesn't have to attend to any of the biological functions. What are those? Bernice laughed, causing a curse and a little howl from one of the ladies as the stitching split. There was a time, I recall, when you were quite enthusiastic about all of them. She held one of the ladies back and straightened up, massaging her lower back. So, nobody can get their stories straight. She plucked a flower from a vase by the window and experimented with it as her trousseau. Fasten your safety belt. We're in for a bumpy ball. Wolsey raised an eyebrow, then lowered it again.